presentation I considered a very important one. So in her absence, I'll just summarize the gist of the paper she wrote. She wrote about 3 Caribbean activist intellectuals who had a great influence on Nkrumah's life. The first was C.L.R. James of Trinidad. C.L.R. James arrived in England and first started his career in England as a writer. He wanted to be a writer of fiction. He ended up becoming a journalist, most importantly writing about cricket, which Anglophone Caribbeans are rather very passionate about. He also, C.L.R. James, also became involved in the anti-colonial movement and worked with so many other intellectuals, including Paul Robeson. And when the Italians invaded Ethiopia, it was C.L.R. James and Paul Robeson who started a certain campaign to mobilize Africans to protest Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, which was at that time also called Abyssinia. C.L.R. James also lived in this country and worked as a mobilizer. And in fact, it was C.L.R. James who Nkrumah met as he was about to leave the United States and go to England. He gave him a letter of introduction to the next Caribbean, another Trinidadian. His official name is Malcolm Nurse, but he's known to history as George Padmore. Nkrumah and George Padmore were responsible for organizing the 5th Pan-Africanist Congress. And this was the Pan-Africanist Congress that perhaps was the most important in the history of the Pan-African movement, which had its first meeting in 1900. After the Pan-African Congress, Nkrumah was sent as part of the Congress resolution to go to France and meet with all those African politicians who, even before they became independent, were members of French Parliament. The French colonial system worked this way. Each colonial territory had representation in France, both in France's equivalent of the House of Representatives and the Senate. Nkrumah did go there. He found, and perhaps the history of Africa would have been different if Nkrumah were a little bit more appreciative of the type of colonialism that French Africa endured. Seeing these Africans in Paris, whilst their countries were still colonies, dressed up in their fancy clothes and being more French than the French themselves, Nkrumah gave up on them. Said, these people, we better move on without them. So finally, when he did move back to Ghana, he sent for George Padmore to be his special advisor on African affairs. Of course, this did not go down very well in the then Gold Coast, now Ghana. Many of Nkrumah's associates were asking, what does this Caribbean, they had all kinds of epithets for one another, what has this Caribbean sugarcane Negro got to know about Africa? Of course, at the time, George Padmore was perhaps the most knowledgeable on Africa because he had worked in Moscow. He had worked as the Comintern's point man on Africa. And the books that he wrote then caused quite a bit of a stir in the empire, because nobody in the colonial administration had ever heard about a person called George Padmore, let alone an authority on Africa. George Padmore did move to Africa and worked as Nkrumah's advisor on African affairs. And just like he and Nkrumah organized the 5th Pan-African Congress, this Caribbean man was again very critical in the organization of what might be considered the 6th Pan-African Congress, but it wasn't called that. It was called the All Africa Conference. There were two. One conference of those countries that were already independent, and the other was of all those countries that were now on the way to becoming independent. And anybody who was somebody in the anti-colonial movement in Africa was there. Tom Mboya from Kenya. And of course, Patrice Lumumba from the Congo, and Sékou Touré from Guinea. The next Caribbean who had a critical influence on Nkrumah, or who Nkrumah worked with very closely, ended up becoming the first black person to receive the Nobel Prize in economics, Arthur Lewis, from the Caribbean island of St. Lucia. And perhaps we owe this St. Lucian a critical understanding of how capitalism works and the role that black people played in that process. Arthur Lewis was the first to advance the argument that the development of modern capitalism depended very critically on the unfree labor of those who were enslaved in the Americas. The standard history of classical economics, from Ricardo to Karl Marx, was that value is created by the surplus value is created from that income that the workers are not paid. So that perhaps is the beginning of classical economics from Ricardo to Karl Marx, who never factored into the equation the value of the unfree labor of Africans. And it was Arthur Lewis who argued that you have to factor into the development of capitalism the unpaid labor of African Americans and other people of African descent in the Americas, and that it was their labor that actually created what we now know as the capitalism, the capitalist system. The standard history is that there was the Crusades, which allowed poor white people from Europe to get booty from the Middle East, which they invested. But that investment was important in the transformation of Europe from feudalism to early capitalism. The next stage of the capitalist development, for that, the unfree labor of enslaved Africans were critically important. Let's take just two crops, tobacco, or three crops, tobacco, sugar, and cotton. These are all very difficult crops, but the history of England and the history of the United States would not be the way it is today, but for the unfree labor of for the unfree labor of enslaved Africans. So he had these three critically important Caribbeans as his associates and as his collaborators. All of them had some kind of a social democratic program, and that helped Nkrumah understand what the challenges he was going to face if he wanted to transform the Gold Coast from a formerly dependent colony to becoming a very self-sufficient one. It's also important to note that during Nkrumah's time, there were lots of African Americans and people from the diaspora who returned to Ghana to work there. Up to today, street lights in Accra is the work of an African American. Even the whole history of how Nkrumah came to the United States in the first place has to be traced back at least to the late 1800s, when another Caribbean person from Barbados, John Bryan Small, became the first bishop of the AME Zion Church. John Bryan Small was responsible for the coming to the United States of the most famous African in the 1920s, James Kwame Nkrumah, who happened to be Nkrumah's teacher in high school, who inspired Nkrumah to come to the United States. So perhaps if we recall James Ngugi's thesis about the dismembering of Africa, we also have to bear in mind that yes, there was dismemberment, but the dismemberment has never been complete. So that at least offers us a certain hope that notwithstanding all the prejudices Africans and people in the diaspora have about one another, notwithstanding the prejudices that mainstream society still has about Africans and peoples of African descent, that process of dismemberment has never been complete, and it is precisely that fact that also inspired this conference to ask students to look to find out what the connections between the continent and its diasporas will be. Nkrumah was also, perhaps one of his failings was that he was a meddler in everybody's business. The Caribbeans didn't like it very much when the British proposed a Caribbean federation, bringing all the islands together. For the Caribbean politicians, this is England trying to meddle in our affairs again. The British also proposed that all the former dependent countries in Southern and Central Africa also found the Central African Federation. Again, the politicians in those countries, what we now know today as Zambia, Zimbabwe, Malawi, all kicked against this. Hey, this is a time for us to have our own independence, and the British are trying to meddle in our affairs by asking us to form a federation. This is just another way that they could create market. These were proposals made by the colonial office in England. But Nkrumah saw beyond it. He saw beyond the fact that it was the British who are proposing these federations, because he understood very clearly that these colonial units are not capable of being self-sustaining. So whether it was the British who proposed it or not, he saw in it the possibility of Africa pulling its resources together. And incidentally, that is also the point of view of those three imported Caribbeans who worked with him: C.L.R. James, George Padmore,